So we're looking at services that we need to configure for support for our network. One of the first ones we'll take a look at is DHCP. Let's look at those configurations. With DHCP, we want to be able to provide resources to some computers on our network. So in our little packet tracer infrastructure here, what we'll do is we'll make R1 be our DHCP server. Again, most of the time in a corporate infrastructure, you'll have one centralized DHCP server someplace in your data center. Maybe at some point we'll make server 1 down here be our DHCP server. But in the meantime, maybe we've had some discussion that our WAN link is less than stellar. And we don't want to put extra traffic across it for whatever reason. So we're going to make R1 be the DHCP server for this segment over here on the left. We have to think about is what addresses we want to allocate. Well, we already know it's the 10 address space. So we're going to allocate addresses out in the 192.168.10.0 address space /24. So ultimately that will be the network that we're providing addresses from. However, there are a few addresses that we can't use, right? .1, that's my router interface already. And I'm not going to have my router be a DHCP client in this case. It's the DHCP server. It's not going to allocate itself an address. I don't want it to get an address, so I'm going to statically assign that .1 address, so 192.168.10.1 to the fast Ethernet 00 interface of my router. What about this switch? Should we let the switch be a DHCP client? There's no really reason to do that. We statically want to be able to manage this device, so in our management software we'll actually be sending our request to a specific IP address. So whatever the switch's IP address is, we probably want to exclude that as well. Maybe we have a couple of printers that aren't shown in this diagram. So there's probably a range of addresses that we want excluded, and we will use the excluded address command. It's prefaced with IPDHCP excluded address command to exclude certain addresses. And we'll exclude .1 for sure. We need .2, 3, I don't know how many. So let's go all the way up through .9. So we're going to exclude that from the range for our hardware devices that sit on the network. I'm also going to exclude .254. I like to have another address at the other end of the range for maybe some special purpose or for testing or something that I can use that won't get allocated for whatever reason. But the rest of the addresses are perfectly fine to be included, so we'll use the network statement for that. When we give an IP address, we don't just give an IP address, we also have to give the mask. So when we create our pool of addresses or our scope of addresses, we're going to include the network that we're going to give addresses from. We're going to include the mask that we want to push down to the client. And that will actually become part of the network statement when we do it. So these two guys kind of roll together when we do it, but we have to push the mask down. I want to push down my default gateway. In our DHCP configuration for Cisco, it's called our default router. That will be the default gateway that we push down to our clients. We want to configure a domain name system server or DNS server. So that's one of the parameters that my machines need to be able to query a DNS server. In this case, we'll also use our 30.200 machine over here as DNS. And we want to supply the domain name for our infrastructure. Again, Cisco.com, Google.com. In our case, well, I don't know, we'll use example.com just so we have something to see. So example.com, not very neat there at the end, but we got it. And these are our scope options or our DHCP options that we'll want to push down to the client. And then hopefully, when we're all done, then our PC down here will be able to get an address directly from the DHCP server. Right now, we have it configured initially as a static address, but we'll take a look at that shortly as we go forward. I'll leave those up there if I can. Let me just erase the marks that are on my screen here, so when I bring up my router, we're good to go. So here's my router. Here's my router interface, and again, I've left the writing on the board so we know what pieces and parts that we're looking for. This is R1. My console password was console. I'm now at user executive mode. I need to go to privileged executive mode. My enable password was Cisco. That gets me into my privileged exec. Now I want to be able to configure my router. So I'm going to configure from the terminal, and I want to configure DHCP. Now the way that we do this, the first thing I'm going to do before I create my pool, before I create my scope, I want to put my excluded addresses in here. So my excluded address will be IP DHCP excluded address, and that would be the 192.168.10.1 through 192.168.10.9 space, and that's a range statement that I have in there. I also want to exclude the last address, so I use the up arrow to bring back my history, and I'm going to do 10.254. So I'm going to exclude both of those. So I have a range from 1 to 9 and then the 254 address. Now, if I'm anal or I want to just see, I can always do a do, show, run here. That will allow me to see that at least some of my configuration is set up. Whoops, jumped down forward on you there. So far I've set up my DHCP excluded address, my DHCP excluded address, and we're good to go. Most excellent. So we'll go on and do our pool. So what we're going to do is create IP DHCP pool, and we'll name this thing LAN pool 10. Notice my prompt changes to DHCP-config. So I'm now configuring that scope, that pool of addresses we're putting in place. So the scope or the pool that we're configuring here, first thing we want to do is set up the network that we're working with. It's the 192.168.10.0 pool. 255 is the mask that we'll be using, .255.255.0. So that's the pool of addresses that we're pulling from. Now we already did our excludeds. So even if for some reason machines get addresses right now, they will not get one of those overlapping addresses. They won't get one of the pre-assigned addresses. The next scope option I want to put in place is my default router. So default router is going to be 192.168.10.1. I want to set up my DNS server. So my DNS server address is going to be that the packet tracer router that was in there. I'm sorry, the packet tracer server that was in there, 192.168.30.200. Geez, I think that was the address. Let me check to make sure. 30.200, sure enough. And I want to configure my domain name as example.com. And that should take care of everything, right? We created our pool, we've got the network, the mask we put in place, we have our default gateway, our default router, we have our default DNS server, and a domain name. That should take care of everything for me. If I do a do, show, run, just because I'm anal and I want to see it, there's my pool. Perfect, and everything is set up for me. Sorry about that. So let's go back and do an exit. Exit. My DHCP should be running for me. So now what does that do? Well, that means that my client machine, my PC machine, should be getting an address. So if I look at my PC, I go to my command prompt. I guess we can get rid of that other stuff for now. There's my command prompt. Something's in the way there. Sorry about that. Oops, I see. I've got my PC in the wrong place. There we go. Now I can see everything for me. So I'm going to do an IP config and see that I have an address of 192.168.10.100. Should have started with like 10. If I do an IP config /all and I look at it, I don't have a DHCP server configured. No, I do have a DHCP server. I must have actually heard from it from a previous example. But I'm not getting a DHCP address at this time. So what I want to do is go to my IP configuration screen and notice in here that I'm set up for static right now. If I go to DHCP, requesting an address, successful. So now it's 10.10. I now actually have my default gateway is 10.1. My DNS server is 30.100. So I've got my IP address information now from my DHCP server. So if I go back to my command prompt on my PC and do ipconfig in here now, I now actually have that 10 address, and I have my default gateway information in here as well. Again, that was static before, but it's 10 now instead of 100. If I do my ipconfig /all, I have my full information where my name is example.com. My address was the first address in the pool. There's my default gateway. There's my DNS server, which wasn't configured from before. It tells me that my DHCP server is actually coming from 192.168.10.1. So that's actually setting up my router as a DHCP server. Well, if we go to the next scenario where I said, well, you know what, we really don't want this machine to be our DHCP server, it's not necessary, we want to have centralized administration, so what I want to do is I'm actually going to set up my server down here as my DHCP server. And that will work just fine for me. Remembering the process that goes through, when PC1 wants to get an IP address, PC1 does a DHCP discover, and that's how PC1 asks for an address, discover. And this goes out as a broadcast.